Welcome to the Regulation Podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Marcial Bou, Chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. This is episode 18 of our podcast, and it focuses on a topic which I know a lot of us are grappling with at present: AI, artificial intelligence. It's not just that the technology is new and powerful, but for us as regulators, we know that AI presents both opportunities and risks to our work. Opportunities to harness the technology to make our regulatory practice more efficient and effective, but risks to the sectors we regulate too. Yet few of us really understand the technology or are able to assess those opportunities and risks. Lawmakers are trying to catch up with new standards and regulatory regimes in the United States and the European Union. Here in the UK, in March last year, the UK government published a white paper on regulating AI, which focused on promoting innovation. They asked regulators to take account of AI in our work. Some regulators have formed a group to do this, to cooperate, but others, maybe especially the smaller and medium-sized regulators, lack the requisite know-how. So, how should AI be regulated so we can benefit from its potential but mitigate its risks? And how can we in the UK successfully regulate a technology that so easily crosses national boundaries? As this is such a big, fast-moving topic, we're clearly not going to cover everything about regulating AI or how AI supports regulators in a half-hour podcast. But we have with us today two global experts who will help us as regulators to understand the current state of play and some of its implications for us. Julia Black is Director of Innovation and Professor of Law at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and has worked at the universities of Oxford, Sydney and Victoria Wellington in New Zealand. Her main research interest is in regulatory systems, and she's written extensively on regulatory issues and advised policymakers, consumer bodies and regulators as well on regulatory policy and design. And among many other roles, Julia is also on the Bank of England's Prudential Regulation Committee, and for the last 3 years has been president of the British Academy. Goodness, Julia, welcome very much.
Thank you. Delightful to be here.
And also we have Joey Conway, who's a digital regulation specialist and partner at Deloitte's Global Digital Regulation Practice. She advises clients on responding to digital and AI regulation, regulatory governance, risk and compliance. She's also a practicing digital and regulatory lawyer and sits on the Law Society's Intellectual Property Committee. Her team's won awards for their digital regulation work. So thanks very much for joining us too, Joey.
Thank you very much.
Now, introductions over. Let's start with the definition. The two letters AI are bandied around to describe all sorts of things, from the algorithms of search engines through to machine learning and what can properly be discussed as intelligent functions. So, starting with Joey, you first. When you're talking about AI, what do you mean?
It's actually not an easy question at all. And we've seen that with different legislations that have been going through the process globally. How to actually define what AI is difficult. But broadly speaking, it's about a machine-based system, and it needs to be one that infers from a set of inputs and creates an output, and that output can have an influence. Now, that's very high level, of course, but there are a couple of principles which come up in that definition. So adaptiveness and autonomy are two which underpin AI. So the adaptivity of the system itself, which can be that it adapts according to the input. So that's the learning piece. And then autonomy, which is around those decisions aren't necessarily prescribed. They're what the system itself infers. So those two principles we see, for instance, in the UK framework definition, and also they appear in the EU AI Act as example. But a real challenge we see is how to future-proof that definition and delineate from other technology. We're seeing other definitions that are influential, like the OECD's, and it's been a very difficult point in the development of legislation, as I've said. What's interesting, I think, about the UK framework, obviously, which is of importance to your listeners, is the fact that there is a little bit of flexibility around that definition, and therefore there is some flexibility potentially around the scope. And the definition obviously sets out the scope of the regulation. So when I work with regulated entities, they may consider that flexibility is good, but they're going to be looking for guidance from regulators on the use cases that are borderline. How do they determine whether they are or are not in scope of the regulatory framework?
Right. Okay. So some technical stuff there, but also some principles. Julia, from your point of view, does that accord with your own definition of what AI means in practice?
No, completely. And I think what we're seeing, we've got a plethora, haven't we, of different definitions as Joe's coming out from different organizations. We've got the OECD, we've got the EU, we've got the US, we've got every different country. We do have some coalescence now across those key elements that Joe is describing. But I think one of the questions then is, well, how do we design? How critical is it for us in defining the regulatory regime that we have a technical definition? So one of the things that is the sort of debate is around was, well, we can't regulate anything at the moment because if we focus it on the technology is constantly changing and it will get constantly out of date. So therefore we have to do nothing. So I think one of the challenges for regulators that we have in the UK is they're asked to absorb the use of AI in the regulatory context in which they're already regulating into that system. Now, in a way, because you're not pinning their regulatory remit on the definition, the fact that the definition is still in flux, in a way, doesn't necessarily. We have to then to ask, well, to what extent does that really matter? Do you know what I mean? Whereas if you are defining, as the EU has done, to say, well, we will regulate AI in this way, then you go to a technology-based definition. So what we're seeing is arguments around, well, if you can go to a kind of an outcomes focus, which is technology neutral, does that provide a way forward for how to get sort of pro-innovation regulation or enable innovation to happen in a way which is still subject to guardrails without being prisoner to this a very technical definition that might become outdated too quickly?
Goodness. Okay, so I thought asking about the definition of two letters might create a simple answer, but no. So, okay, so let's recognize that, as you say, there are different definitions. It is moving quickly, and we need to make sure that whatever AI is, and you've outlined, both of you, some of the characteristics that it has. We need to make sure that regulation is going to be effective. And Julia, I know that you've been thinking about this for many years, and back in 2019, which is a long time ago in this context, you co-wrote a paper where you said that how the AI revolution develops and how our society absorbs its potential will be largely determined by the models of regulation and governance applied to it. So clearly regulation's important. What did you mean by when you said that all of those years ago?
So it does feel like an age in AI terms. What I was really thinking about there is in terms of how the technology, which is I think it's very important. This is a general purpose technology when defined in its broadest sense. So it's unlike other areas where we've looked at where you have, okay, well, this is food, or this is finance, or this is higher education, or a fairly well-defined area of economic activity, and you can sort of define that who's in that market, as it were, and you can decide what the risks are, and therefore how that you're going to regulate that. In the context of AI, it's going to be everywhere. It is everywhere. So I was talking to somebody recently. They said, "Oh, well, we don't. Should we regulate it like we regulate the internet, or should we regulate it like we regulate nuclear power?" And the answer is, well, it's both, right? Because it is going to be in both areas and both sectors. But I think what's interesting about, or what's challenging at the moment, is it is being differently regulated, as particularly the way that the UK government is implementing its AI regulatory approach, which is to say to existing regulators, well, carry on doing what you're doing, regulating in the way that you're regulating, and just absorb AI into that regulatory framework. And the assumption there is that, AI will, in those contexts, or AI more generally, will continue to pose the same types of risks that are currently being posed by other technologies or practices or market practices, whatever it is. Now, that may well be true. So, AI in the development of a healthcare product, there are lots of issues in the regulation of a healthcare product. We have a very gated market, Okay, so the proliferation of AI in the context of medical devices, for example, is going to be very controlled because it's existing, going into an existing market, which is, say, highly regulated. It's a clear gateway you have to go through before you can go out to market. Lots of other areas there isn't that gated market. So, for example, in educational products, you don't have that same kind of pre-licensing. So you're going to have, as it were, differential controls by the way that we're absorbing AI through our regulatory framework. Now, that may be fine, but I think one of the things that we need to challenge ourselves on is whether the use of AI and the proliferation is going to create new risks, which are not currently captured. And then how do you go about that? And as you say, you've got the kind of, just a stereotype, as it were, you've got the EU approach, which is you go for the technology and then think about the risks and et cetera, or you go for the UK, which is you think about the current risks and just absorb AI into that. So that's what I was meaning really by how it develops. And that includes also the economic infrastructure and the nature of that, which is the concentration risk, the oligopolies, et cetera, the big tech companies, platformization, et cetera, which we're seeing. And I think that just goes to the fundamental point, which and everybody who's a regulator knows, which is regulation structures markets.
Yeah. Well, so what I'm hearing there, amongst other things, is that every regulator needs to think about this, and that the way that they regulate, the nature of the sector that they regulate, whether they're an economic regulator, the sanctions and the barriers that they impose will all be impacted by AI and the development of new AI techniques and tools. But the way that manifests will be different in different sectors, and we all need to think about that. When I was regulating equality, there were no barriers that could be imposed, but AI was absolutely having an impact on discrimination, as I'm sure you are aware. So, Joey, coming to you, that interface between regulation and AI, or the way that AI manifests in different regulated sectors, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And obviously, we spend a lot of my time advising clients on how to respond to regulation across all digital regulations, and not just AI. And when we're talking to those clients, the main thing we're talking to them about is how do you manage the risks within your business? And regulation is one of those risks. But where you're in a space like technology and you're innovating, to manage those risks, you need to have proper risk management in place. So regulation can be a key tool in driving consistent approaches to managing risks. And that means, from our perspective, from a society perspective, we can protect societal values. And you can see that message very clearly in how the EU has developed its EU AI Act. But the other thing which regulation does is it levels the playing field. It ensures that everybody is reaching the same basic level when they put in place risk management and when they adopt and use these new technologies. Now, that can enable innovation. So the key is getting that balance right. The regulation should be helping manage the risks, but enabling the innovation as well. And when that happens, you drive responsible and successful AI sector, which of course is part of what the UK is trying to do with its UK AI framework. So it's got this ambition to be a global AI power, and it recognises that regulation can be an enabler for that.
Okay, so goodness, that's all very helpful. You've mentioned there about risk. One of the things that regulators think a lot about is risk management and trying to intervene on a risk-based basis. Regulators obviously a lot smaller than the markets that they regulate, so they need to use their judgment about where and when to intervene. Julia, coming to you, you've written about frameworks of regulation, but also about this concept of explainability, so that regulators and others can understand what's happening inside the black box of the AI tool. And I know that lots of regulators care about explaining their decisions so that markets are predictable and stable, and people know where they stand in relation to the rules and their application. So how will that manifest in respect of AI? Because obviously there is that black box there, and sometimes these so-called hallucinations pop out of things that aren't quite real. And you've written about the need for some accountability too in the way that AI works, particularly when it's impacting on decisions. So can you just explore some of those issues for us and our listeners?
So listen, I think the issue of explainability or interpretability is becoming one of the key issues as we move into different types of AI models. So very crudely, if you've got quite a simple, more decision tree model, a sort of more of a white box, if this, then that, if this, then that, then okay, there can be hundreds, if not thousands of parameters, but you can at least route back to say, but this is the path, this is the kind of logical pathway. But with the newer models, which are more based on neural networks, that you've got, as Joe was saying before, you've got a bunch of inputs basically, and you've had some objectives which have been set explicitly or implicitly. And what you have there is you have then the model itself drawing on the data on which it's been trained and then responding to new inputs based on that training, and in ways producing outputs in ways which are actually quite hard to explain, even for the developers and the coders, which means they're quite hard to predict. So I think what's happening in this sort of ask, as it were, and it's interesting, we use explainability or interpretability interchangeably, whereas in fact they're not, but they are being used in that way, is that it does mean different things to different people. And I can identify, I sort of write down a list of what this is meant to be, at least 4 different asks, as it were, which are being captured in this term, which themselves break down into some sub-asks. I think the first one is, first group is around performance. So, first is about predictability. Okay, so I've got my model now responding to a new input, might be a new prompt, might be a new set of data. How can I predict what that model is the output that model is going to produce? And in order to be able to give some prediction, I need to understand how it arrives at its decisions. So that's one kind of ask, as it were, for explainability. Kind of second and linked ask is, well, I also need to worry about the quality. So Marcel, you talked about hallucinations, for example. So I need to be able to think about, well, is it giving me a high quality output or the right answer? Now, at the moment, if it's being used to give us answers to questions that if we went away, we could probably find answers to ourselves, it would just take us a lot of time. Then there's a way in which you can go back and you can do some testing, etc. But as the models get more powerful and go beyond human capability, then how on earth can we know that what the output is something that we can trust? So there's a performance element there, which goes to, say, predictability, assurance, and trust. And then there's a second set of sort of asks which go to the risk management and which go to, well, what happens when something goes wrong? So I want to be able to do a root cause analysis. So how do I do a root cause analysis when I don't understand the roots and I don't understand the causes? So how do I know what that looks like? And I want to be doing that partly from a risk management point of view, but also because I might want to be attributing liability. So how do I know, and this is particularly complicated where you've got not just one model, but you've got a kind of daisy chain of models, or you've got it distributed across a stack, as it were. So where do I know, where in the chain, as it were, was the problem, A, to fix it, and B, to actually attribute liability for that problem? So there's a whole sort of second group there, which is around, the correction of the dealing of something when it goes wrong. And then there's, I suppose, a third group, which takes us more into the realm of, I suppose, in a way, human dignity, which is you want to have reasoned decisions. And particularly if the model's being used in a context where it's allocating credit scores, or it's allocating, facial recognition of victims of justice, in justice context, etc. Then, there's a legal right under public law to have a reasoned decision. Decision makers have to give reasons for decisions. So, and not to be treated arbitrarily. And that it also goes to, giving a reason goes to the kind of the output quality and how can I trust what it is that you're saying is true, because you should be able to tell me why you've come to that conclusion, given the inputs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so all of those are all very valid, but they're all actually slightly different. And I think probably what we need to be doing is start unpacking. Always end up using that term, though I know that unpacking, as it were, what we mean by explainability and interpretability in different contexts, because actually how we achieve all the different ends that we're seeking, I've just sort of mapped out, might have to come through in different ways, including different technological solutions.
Yeah. Goodness me. Well, I can imagine lots of regulators listening will have palpitations listening to all of those problems where many regulators have spent best part of a decade or more trying to find ways in which they can reach reasoned decisions that are explainable and defend them and be accountable for them, when those decisions sometimes mean the livelihood of, or otherwise, of the people that they're regulating, whether it's a business or a professional, or as you say, whether somebody gets any work or not. So, goodness, this is all going to be quite difficult for regulators. Joey, from your experience of those people that you're working with, bearing in mind all of the dilemmas that Julia's just outlined, what do you think has to happen now? I mean, you've talked about some of the new measures that are being put in place by the EU, the UK, and others. But what should happen now in terms of taking this further?
So in terms of the UK, obviously we've got the UK AI framework coming in. So regulators are working hard at the moment in terms of the ones who've been asked to devise a strategy and publish that. That's happening. And there's more work going to be done over the course of a year. From speaking to regulators and regulated entities alike, what is clear is there needs to be dialogue. There needs to be active consideration of where are the key issues here, because this is a very broad area and it is moving very fast. So we're seeing regulated entities asking for help in relation to specific issues and guidance on specific things. And I think there's an exercise for regulators in terms of actually, of course, listening to your regulated cohort and working out where you can best assist them. The other thing which is really important and is happening and is being set up is that dialogue between regulators, because of course trying to tackle this in a silo or alone will raise challenges. So cooperation between regulators, both nationally and internationally, obviously makes sense from an efficiency perspective, but also will drive a higher quality result. And we're seeing some very interesting and innovative approaches to that in this country. So the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum is a great example of some of the very key regulators in this space, closest perhaps to the technology, working together, producing joint guidance. And we're also seeing the government itself acknowledging this with setting up, for example, the central function to assist regulatory coordination. So I think we're very much at that point of regulators listening, asking the questions, and then honing in where they can actually support the most across their sectors.
Yeah, that sounds very sensible. And the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum, I think that's one you mentioned. I think it's got 4 or 5 regulators in there, as you say, the Ofcoms and others who are most closely connected. And we at the Institute of Regulation are talking to them because all kinds of other regulators, as you said earlier on, are grappling with these issues in their own domains, even though they don't have the kind of core responsibility that regulators like Ofcom do. And at the Institute of Regulation, we're hoping to have some sessions later in the year where we can get regulators together to talk about exactly these kinds of issues, which lots of people are yearning for, as you know. You mentioned the international angle, because obviously, as we all know, these technologies cross boundaries and make that much harder to regulate with consistent rules that apply in various jurisdictions. So, Julia, bearing in mind what Joey's just said about what needs to happen next in terms of dialogue about the issues and between regulators, what else in your mind needs to be done, both domestically and internationally?
So listen, I completely agree with Joey, but also, and it's also great that the Institute of Regulators is going to be bringing other regulators together, because we do tend to focus on, the big beasts, as it were. And the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum is a great initiative, but I think it's only, the sandbox that they're going to be doing, for example, will be fantastic, but it is only for businesses who are going to be regulated by 2 of those regulators. So, that leaves a lot out. And as you say, regulators are really crying out for some guidance, and some are better resourced. So ICO, CMA, obviously CMA particularly well resourced, but others just don't have the resources to be looking at this in the same way. So the more that support can be given, both sort of across the regulated community, as it were, with the Institute as a facilitator of that, but also I think from government and from some of the expert bodies which government is busy building up to really help them build up capacity, I think the better. I know government's putting some funding into this, so regulators definitely go and sort of bid for that funding to get that capacity build up. That can be enormously valuable and keep pressing for more. So there is definitely a piece of work to be done at the domestic level in terms of building up those capabilities. I would also like to see a stronger coordinating hub across government. So I know there was a lot of discussion around the sort of institutional architecture and whether there should be a separate sort of AI regulator which actually brings together and actually performs this coordinating function. I think it's quite interesting. We had the Committee on Standards of Public Life putting out questionnaires on how ready regulators feel, which is interesting, but is an odd body to be doing that, noble though it is. So I would really like to see more action, as it were, and coordination and capacity building at that central government level, because, as we said before, it is a general technology, and there are a lot we can learn, about basic risk management and governance of models and how we can that can be disseminated across others. But also the same companies are going to be operating different sectors. So the greater coordination you can have, then the better that is for industry, and therefore the better is that for economic growth and economic performance. But then secondly, as you said, this is global, and many of our regulators are already operating in a context of globalized standards. We see that in food, we see that in finance, we see that in, numbers of different areas, particularly on sort of high risk areas. So you've already got the interlay, as it were, of these international regulators, as well as the standards which are being produced at the international level, at the technical level, for technical standards for AI regulation and AI development. So in terms of the need for international coordination, it's enormous. I think people recognize that. I think what is in discussion at the moment is, well, what kind of model? Do we go for the sort of the expert watcher model, kind of, which sort of just says, well, this is how the technology is evolving, and these are the risks you need to look out for, and then it's down to the national level as to how you do address those risks. Nothing wrong with that. It's quite a good model. Or at the other end, the area I work in is financial regulation, for example. You have that overall kind of watching function, but you also have a global standard setter that sets some principles at a very high level, and also some exceptionally detailed rules, which are then implemented at the regional and national level. So there are multiple other different models out there. So if we are to move to this international coordination, do we do it on a bilateral basis, a multilateral basis? Do we, what's our level of ambition? Particularly when you've got countries with very different, should we say, incentives and sets of values for particularly around some of the different more societal risks that we might be concerned about.
Goodness. Well, this question of international coordination, or dare I say it, regulation, is obviously relevant here, but it's also in the context of the COVID pandemic that we experienced a few years ago. It's relevant to public health, it's relevant to trade and finance issues, and of course it's relevant to the environment as well, where the seas and the air blows over countries regardless of political boundaries. And we do need, as a world, I suspect, to work these issues out so that whether it's AI or it's the environment, we can find ways in which we can help us all to live well within some kind of fair and predictable rules-based system, if we can. Joey, before we close with perhaps some tips from both of you to the regulators listening on what they can do next, are there any reflections that you've got on what Julie's just said about international coordination and some of the things that need to happen next?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with everything Julia said, but I think from a regulator perspective, it's making sure that you're part of that international dialogue. Because when you think about the regulated sectors themselves, consistency is so important. The more fragmented the regulatory landscape is for these companies that are operating cross-border and often globally, then the less consistency you have, the less efficient they can be in terms of putting in place institutional compliance. Now, the risks of that are obviously if you don't have efficient compliance, then potentially the risks aren't managed properly, and that can be a risk to society as a whole. But the other issue, of course, is it can inhibit innovation. So if the cost of compliance and the compliance burden is so high in terms of complexity and resource required, then you're going to potentially inhibit that innovation, which we're all striving for. So I think it's really important to try and have that international view on this and think about this through the lens of the entities you're regulating and how they're not just trying to implement regulation in certain countries. They're trying to come up with something consistent across all jurisdictions they operate in. And I think we're seeing that, but that lens is really important.
Okay, thank you. So sticking with you for a moment, Joey, what I'm hearing you say to people who are regulators listening to this is there are three things that they can do. One is to understand their sector and the risks involved of AI in that sector, because they understand that sector best, but also to talk about these issues with the entities that they regulate. Second, we heard obviously from you and Julia earlier on that people need to speak to other regulators that they interface with so that they can work collectively to tackle some of these problems. And we at the Institute of Regulation are hoping to put a bid together on behalf of regulators for some of this money to try to work out how we can best do that. And third, as you've both said also, to be part of the international dialogue, recognizing that there are issues that cut across domestic jurisdictions. Our last podcast talked to the regulator of vets in the UK, where obviously people come to the UK to train as vets and they go and practice overseas. Animals move backwards and forwards and so on and so forth. So international issues impact on every regulator, I'm sure. But Joey, apart from those things, what other tips would you give to people listening to this about what they could be doing proactively to get on top of some of these issues?
I think there's a large piece, and this isn't unique to regulators. It's all of us really, and everybody in these sectors as well. It's about sort of upskilling and informing yourself. So accessing information that's out there, speaking to entities like this, of course, like the Institute of Regulation, but also there are tools that are being developed now. So one that's probably worth talking about is the Digital Regulation Corporation Forum, their new AI digital product, which enables an entity to ask a question across multiple regulators. So there are tools available. There's a lot of information out there. And I think it's beholden on all of us to actually be trying to keep up with the pace of thinking and development of this technology in order to be able to be efficient at ultimately enabling its success.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Julia, let's end with you. Any further advice that you would give to people who are professional regulators or interested in regulation and making it effective in this area?
So I completely agree. It is about, we are all struggling, aren't we, to keep up and to become as familiar as we need to be about the technology, but also to understand it from a regulatory point of view, to understand not just what risks is it posing, but also really understand its development, really understand its life cycle, so we can understand the most appropriate points of intervention. So where are the best points of leverage and over whom to ensure that, the model achieves what it is we want it to achieve in any particular context. And that actually does require quite close engagement with those who work in model development, those who are working in the industry, in the AI industry itself, to understand exactly how these models and tools are being developed, to understand the function of the general purpose model, to understand what applications are being built on that, to understand then the point that you get at a regulator as a very, very end user, to really encourage those end users and those you're regulating to be having the same conversations actually that regulators need to be having with those who are in the AI industry itself. So I would really encourage engagement, not just with your own sector, but with those who are working in the AI industry. And that would include, if you can prize them out, some secondments, etc. But I would also encourage. Now, the academic community is also struggling because it just doesn't have the financial resources or compute power, to be frank, but that does have quite a lot of intellectual horsepower to be working with universities as well, in this sector. And again, encouraging them to come along to anything you're putting on the Institute of Regulators, but also to have some secondments to actually bring some expertise in to help everybody just really skill up at pace.
That's fantastic. There's lots and lots and lots of food for thought for regulators there. I won't attempt to summarize what we've discussed, but it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm very grateful to you both, Professor Julia Black of the London School of Economics and Joey Conway from Deloitte, for your insights and your experience that you've brought along today. It's a fascinating topic, and I'm sure we're going to come back to it. And for those of you listening to the podcast, thank you. Do let your colleagues know about this episode, but others too, where we'll be discussing other issues of relevance to regulators. All the information is on the Institute of Regulation's website, ioregulation.org. That's it for now. Thanks again for listening to me, Marcia Albu, at the Regulation Podcast. Good luck with your own regulatory challenges, and do stay in touch with each other, as the speakers today have said, and with the Institute to help UK regulation become the best it can. Thank you very much. Goodbye.